This is From the Courtroom to the Boardroom, the podcast for the next generation of legal leaders with me, Simon Gibson. I was a lawyer for 13 years until I walked away from legal practice and entered the world of business. I'm now CEO of the Spirant Group and I lead a portfolio of businesses in the UK and Australia. On this upbeat podcast, I tackle the big issues facing law firms and businesses alike with the help of intriguing guests. Are you ready to rewrite the script? Then it's great to have you along for the ride. Hello friends, welcome to the podcast. Today we're talking negotiation. Now, during my legal career, I was a litigator and I spent a good proportion of every day negotiating with opponents, with my team, and even with the odd client. I was also present at many settlement meetings and in court corridors when I watched some of the best barristers around negotiate settlements. So were we any good at it? Are lawyers generally good negotiators? I honestly don't know. I can remember loads of settlements that involved splitting the difference, going 50-50, in situations where it could be argued that a more favourable conclusion should have been sought for the client. So are agreements reached on this basis bad deals? Or does an approach of reasonableness and empathy underpin solid compromises? Well, the answer to that question, or those questions, lies in the art of negotiation, and I'm delighted to welcome one of the world's leading experts in these fields to the podcast today, who is Dr. Joshua Weiss. Dr. Weiss is co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard University. He's the author of many books, including the Book of Real-World Negotiations. He's a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. And Dr. Weiss is also the creator of the Master of Science degree in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University in Massachusetts. Dr. Weiss also has his own business and advises governments, other corporates, and individuals on all matters negotiation. In this episode, we'll be zeroing in on the tactics, techniques, and thought processes behind effective legal negotiation. However, I also want to venture beyond the courtroom to explore how negotiation shapes interactions in other situations and even our daily lives. So this is going to be really great. I hope you really enjoy it. Negotiation is very important for the legal profession, but I think we're going to hear that it's important for everyone. So please do sit back and enjoy my conversation with Dr. Joshua Weiss. Here we go. Josh, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for doing this, sir.
Thank you, Simon. It's great to be with you. It's a real pleasure, and I really look forward to our chat today.
Oh, well, the pleasure is all ours. I must ask you, I've got such a lot to get through, but I must ask you before we start, when was the stage in your own academic career where you really became interested in these issues of negotiation and compromise and dispute resolution? What was it that first interested you, and how did you progress that interest?
Like a lot of people, my first interest in much of this came from my childhood. I grew up where my grandmother actually left Poland when she was 13 years old, and her family died in the Holocaust. And so that was a big narrative for me, was how could something like that happen? And so it was constantly there. And as I grew and began to think about what I wanted to do in the world, I ended up sort of getting more and more attracted to conflict and realizing that when people didn't know how to handle it, it became debilitating and really destructive. And so I thought, let me try to help folks to understand this so that it doesn't have to be so bad. Interestingly enough, the nature of conflict itself is not so bad. It's how we handle it. If we have the skills and the knowledge, we can work things through. And in fact, conflict is kind of a natural part of the human existence. And so, that's really what got me interested in it. And as I gravitated to that realm, I started to get more and more interested in negotiation because I tend to be pretty practical in my orientation, and everybody, that I knew was negotiating in some way, shape, or form. And to your point, I see negotiation as something that happens all day, every day, whether it's at work with bosses, coworkers, in the legal profession. You pick a realm, we're negotiating, and at home with your spouses, kids, parents, or in the world around us. So it became something that I really took to, and I thought, this is something that when people understand how to do this well, their lives and their working world and all these other elements of their lives change dramatically and in a good way. And so that's really what set me down this road. And I continue to my goal in life is try to get this information, knowledge, and skills to as many people as possible.
Well, you do that very well indeed. And particularly, I've enjoyed your Negotiator in You series. We're going to have the links to your website and to all of your socials and to Amazon and that sort of thing in the description for the podcast. But what I particularly enjoyed about that series was the way in which you broke up how negotiation does come in all of those different realms that you described, at home, at work, even in specific areas of business such as sales. So tell me, is negotiation in those different situations, does that differ, the principles, or are there certain principles which underpin all successful compromises?
Yeah, so I believe that negotiation at its core is similar across the board. We use the same kind of skill sets and knowledge. Obviously, the context matters, and so we have to think about what are the dynamics that are different here. But, for me, for example, there's a core set of principles and a core process that I follow in most negotiations. And so, one of my colleagues at Harvard, a well-known negotiation expert, Roger Fisher, who was one of the authors of the famous book, Getting to Yes, wrote an article a little bit before that called Negotiating with Your Wife and Negotiating with the Russians. Was there any difference? And this was during the Cold War. And what he concluded was, of course, there are contextual issues, but in many ways, the process and the ways that you try to go about things are similar. And so, it's interesting because a colleague said to me a couple of weeks ago, when you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation. And in many ways, I think that's right, because there are core principles that are the same, but then, if you try to transfer what you've done in one negotiation wholeheartedly to another, you often miss out because the person you're dealing with is very different in the second negotiation than the first. There might be a power differential. There might be other dynamics at play that you've got to pay attention to. But to answer your question, the core is the same. And then it's almost like a Christmas tree. You hang ornaments on in different ways that make it look different and feel different. And I think that's what happens in negotiation. And that's in many ways what I teach people is to learn a core framework and then understand that framework only takes you so far, right? That you have to be adaptable and flexible in how you approach things, because as we know in negotiation, we're always working with incomplete information, right? So no matter how much we prepare, we have to develop an adaptable and a flexible mindset so that when something comes in that we didn't anticipate or think about, we don't get thrown off of what we're trying to do. We take it in and we think, what do I do with this information? And I will say that one of my, I'll call it a pet peeve in negotiation, is that I don't look at negotiation as a process that's all about compromise. In fact, to me, I actually think about negotiation very much from a problem-solving creativity mindset. And I've seen, the book that you mentioned, the book of real-world negotiations, is 25 cases of negotiation. And when you read it, what you realize is there's very little compromise. It's actually about understanding the underlying interest and the things that are truly motivating people in negotiation, not what they say, right? As a barrister and a lawyer, that often you would talk to people, they would tell you one thing, right? But what was really going on was another thing. And that's our challenge in negotiation, is to understand what's really happening here and what are those things that really matter to people. And I did an article, and I'll stop in one second, but I did an interview about a month and a half ago with Forbes India, and the title of it was "Compromise Should Be the Last Stop on the Train, Not the First." We can always compromise. We can always give things up, but sometimes it's not necessary if we really come to understand what those underlying interests and needs are.
Well, that's a very interesting point you've just made about we're negotiating with incomplete information, and that is the norm when we're negotiating in the legal profession. I mean, the situation that I was very familiar with as a litigator who typically acted for plaintiffs was that we would be engaged in negotiations, often with lawyers acting on behalf of either a defendant company or an insurer who indemnified that company in a damages case, in a settlement. And quite often what you would effectively be talking about is just an amount of money. You would be seeking a settlement on behalf of your plaintiff client. The insurer would be obviously looking to minimize their exposure to that same payment. And I mean, I used to find the process sometimes a little bit, I'll use the word demoralizing. I think that's a bit dramatic, but it did sometimes feel as if you were just sort of inserting numbers into a discussion rather than actually focusing upon an outcome which was in either of your best interests. And a lot of that came down to the fact that we would value our damages claim at £100,000. The lawyers for the insurer would say they valued it at £10,000. Obviously, neither side reveals their hand. And the expression you used to use time and time again was, can you meet me somewhere in the middle? And quite often what you felt, or certainly what you advised your client was reasonable, would effectively just be dictated by how far within the middle ground your opponent was willing to move. And it sometimes occurred to me that that was quite unsatisfactory. I just wondered what your take on. Is that good negotiation or is it unsatisfactory negotiation?
To be perfectly honest, I would call that bartering. I wouldn't even call it negotiation, because all you're doing, I mean, what's the difference between that and buying a rug in a bazaar in the Middle East? Not much, right? So the thing is, to me, negotiation involves understanding the broader picture of what's going on. As bargaining is haggling. It's you and I want to pay less, you want to pay more. Sure, that's part of a negotiation, but you know, there are also a lot of interesting legal cases where people are not just motivated by the money. They feel wronged, they feel taken advantage of, and they want some form of apology. And in those processes, or whatever it might be, there's more to the story, right? And so those processes don't allow for that. They don't allow for the elements that make us human to be part of it. And that's the problem, I think, a lot of the time. And I remember I was working with a company and they were working on $100 million deals. And they said, we need to understand what's going on here and why we're not succeeding. I said, okay. So I said, tell me about your process. They said, well, we send the contract to the other side. They mark it up and send it back. And then we look and think, is that acceptable to us? And if not, we mark it back up and send it to them. And I said, at what point do you meet with them? And they said, oh, we don't meet with them. And I said, stop. That's your problem. Because you're not humanizing the process. You're not understanding what is of value in this situation. And this is the problem and the challenge that I find in negotiation most of the time, which is that people don't realize that negotiation is all about what you and the other side value. And when I say value, it doesn't just mean dollars and cents and pounds and whatever. It means what's important to you, right? If I've been disrespected, then I need to feel respected as part of this process. Otherwise, I'm not going to agree, and you can throw all the money in the world at me. It doesn't matter. So I think it's important for people to understand that you don't negotiate with robots. You don't negotiate around, most of the time you're not negotiating around single issues. There are other things. Whether you allow them into the process is another question. But what I find a lot of times is people are unhappy. You know, here in the US, our judicial system is one where it's about punishment, which is appropriate, but what about the victim? It doesn't really do much for the victim at all, right? So I think that there's what I often say to folks about negotiation is you want to think more broadly about the things that are part of this situation, particularly when they're, of benefit. And usually when you're bringing in other issues, that changes the conversation. It changes the dynamics between you and the other. And you're having a different kind of conversation. And what ends up happening is that people slowly share information about what actually matters to them, right? And too often I find that people feel like there's a need to rush through a negotiation process and get to a deal as fast as possible. And yet, when you slow it down, what you notice is that your deals actually improve.
I can empathize a lot with that. Another circumstance which came to my mind from a legal perspective when you were talking us through that, Josh, was a sort of a circumstance where it's more of a corporate environment where you've got, say, one company buying another, or perhaps some sort of demerger between two companies. And there's generally a lot more to talk through in those circumstances than just the money. You will be talking about things like warranty clauses, indemnities, that sort of thing. And it always strikes me that in a legal scenario, the sort of unspoken complication is that the client's not just on the hook for the outcome, the end. They're also on the hook for the means, because they're paying for the negotiation, fundamentally. They're paying their lawyer to enter into negotiations. So I think it can be quite tempting from a lawyer's perspective, with good intentions, to try and limit the client's exposure to your bill. There tends to be a motivation to rush a bit, or to narrow the issues in a process. Again, that's an expression that's often used. Can we narrow the issues? And I think that combined with perhaps technology, perhaps the point that you've just raised, that we've been encouraged in the legal profession for some years now, the questions, things like, do you really need to meet? Do you really need to speak? Can't this just be done via email? Perhaps the art of negotiation, particularly in the legal profession, is almost being processed out of us.
I don't think that's unrealistic to go down that road. And I also think, in any negotiation, you have to think about the context that you're working in, right? We talked about that before, or the structure. And the legal structure is one that is adversarial in nature, unless you push back against it, right? There are collaborative lawyers and other processes that are out there that say, hey, we don't want to go down that road because it doesn't benefit us. But I think that's right. And I think that when you have forces that are pushing down on you to do things in certain ways, it's hard to resist that. But I will tell you that I've seen a lot of very interesting examples when people do resist and push back a little bit against the norms, that they're able to find better solutions, which in the end is what you want to do for your client.
It completely is. So let's think of the basics here then. In any situation, we're not just thinking about legal situations here, because of course the audience will all be in negotiations throughout their life, at work and at home. Are there any core principles you could share with us in terms of what makes for good and successful compromises?
Yeah. So, as I said, I think the first thing is preparation is a critical element of any negotiation. But how you prepare is very important. A lot of times people want to go in with a concrete plan of, we're going to do this, then this, and this, and we're going to get there. And negotiation doesn't work that way, because, we're back to the incomplete information. So what you really have to do is you have to engage in contingency planning. You still have your end goal, but you've got 3 or 4 different ways that you can get there. Right? So the first thing is, and a lot of times people say to me, well, I don't have time to prepare. And I'll say, well, then you're preparing to fail, essentially. So find the time, do it the right way. That's the first thing. The second thing is, to me, because most of the negotiations I engage with, and when I work with businesses and governments and whomever, and it may be a little bit different in the legal world, most of the negotiations that I engage in are with the same people or the same organizations over and over again. And this is the big distinction, right? If you're doing one-off negotiations, you need one strategy. But if you're going to be negotiating with the same lawyers or the same people over and over again, how you negotiate with them matters greatly. And to me, it's far more advantageous for me to see you in that context if we're going to be negotiating into the future as a partner. I need you to say yes, otherwise I can't get where I want to go. Right? And so I believe that 90% of our negotiations require that way of thinking. And I don't really say win-win because I don't believe life always works that way, but I do think that people can gain if they work effectively and collaboratively because we're back to information, right? We begin to share information. If you and I are engaged in a one-off negotiation, we're very inclined to not share information and to try to, get the best deal we can that way. But if we're going to work together and to create the best deals possible, I need to understand what's really driving you and motivating you. So I would say, if in fact you're going to be negotiating with the same people over and over again, see them as a partner. That doesn't mean, by the way, that doesn't mean be friends. It means you need them, they need you, right? And so you want to be hard on the problem. If you still have a difficult, this is the goal that I have in my negotiation, you have to be firm on that. But, in getting to yes, they talk about being hard on the problem, not the person. It doesn't benefit me to beat you up because I need you to say yes in the end. And then, there's two other principles that really guide me. One is this whole idea of positions and interests, that there are these underlying interests. And the real challenge in negotiation is to uncover what those things are, what's really motivating people. And so positions are basically what people say they want, and interests are why they want those things. And when you get down to interests, in the end, doors open, right? You begin to see how you can satisfy those things without compromise or other kinds of elements. And then the last one, of course, is that you can't negotiate effectively without understanding your BATNA, or your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which really is, in the simplest way possible to put it, is your walk-away alternative. So, people often say to me, well, did I get a good deal? I say, well, the only way I can answer that is if you tell me compared to what, right? So what were you going to walk away to? And is it better than that? And if it is, then yes, you got a good deal. And so those are the core principles that underpin my approach. And then I add other elements as needed based on the situation. But those four aspects of sort of preparation, mindset, seeing the other as a problem-solving partner, positions and interests, and BAT, and I guess you could say five, are kind of how I guide myself through these processes.
It's so interesting. Do you know what came to my mind when you were just talking us through those principles, Josh? I suppose what jumps to a lot of people's mind when they hear the phrase negotiation is a hostage situation. Now, that must be... it must be an interesting circumstance in which negotiators have to apply those principles, because obviously the stakes are so high. Does in that sort of situation, would a negotiator have to bear in mind how high those stakes are, or would the principles be applied in the same manner, albeit with that at the back of their mind, I suppose?
It's interesting because when I wrote the book that I mentioned before, there are 5 hostage negotiation cases in there. And I've had the opportunity to talk to and become friends with a number of people in the hostage negotiation community. And one of the interesting things that they've told me is that success is very hard to measure when it comes to hostage negotiation, because as one person told me, I could do the exact same thing in 2 negotiations, and one would end peaceably with everybody coming out and the hostages being released, and the other one, everybody dies. So from their point of view, what they try to focus on is process. Are we following the proper process and protocols, and recognize that certain things are out of their hands? That there's, if somebody is determined to die by suicide by cop, right? There's not much you can do as a negotiator in that context. But what's interesting is that, hostage negotiation has evolved. There was a guy named Hugh McGowan who I became friendly with, who was the head of the NYPD negotiation hostage unit. And he ended up doing a documentary film for a channel called Arts and Entertainment. And the title of the film was Talk to Me. And I said, why did you call it that? And he said, because that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to build rapport with the hostage taker. We're trying to get them to understand that we're there to listen, because we know there's something there again, we're back to these underlying interests, right? There's something there. There's some trauma. There's something that's happened that they're reacting against. And when we understand that, we can empathize. We can get them to sort of come off of where they are and become a little more rational in the way that they're approaching things. And they, another hostage negotiator said something to me that I think epitomizes their approach. He said, hostage takers are expecting Arnold Schwarzenegger and they get Mr. Rogers. Now, I don't know if everybody in your audience knows who Mr. Rogers was, but he was.
I do. It's the guy on it. It was Tom. Didn't Tom Hanks play him in a recent film?
In a movie, correct.
Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood.
Right.
He's like the consummate American, isn't he? A really nice guy.
When I was a kid, he would come on set and he would put on his sweater and he would sit and talk to you and talk about problems that kids experience and things like that. And so the point is that what hostage negotiators have learned is that that's what resonates with people who are in crisis is, let me build this rapport with them. Let me help them to understand that I'm not trying to just throw them in jail. I actually want to help them to perhaps, go to a mental hospital if they need that kind of help, and things along those lines. So, the dynamics are different, but again, you're still looking for these underlying interests. You're still looking for what's really going on. And a lot of times it's in what I would call the intangible realm, the psychological realm, where somebody, a lot of times people who take hostages feel disrespected, they feel humiliated, it doesn't justify their behavior, but when you understand it, now you have something to work with, right? And before you don't, it's the process used to be, you've got 5 minutes. If you don't give yourself up, we're going to come in and use force. And what they found was that didn't work. In fact, more people were dying, not less.
Podcast today is brought to you by Zeus Tech Solutions, who provide dev on demand for law firms. When I was managing partner of a law firm, recruiting and retaining top tech talent was one of the biggest challenges. And we're still, because we didn't have the knowledge in the business to manage and coach a technical team, it was a constant cycle of frustration, downtime, lost revenue, and proclaim lying dormant. Well, for the past 5 years, Zeus have looked after both of Spire & Group's law firms in the UK and Australia, and it's been a game changer. Now, we get all of our tech on tap, from IT director to .NET developer. We get that whenever we want. Zeus provide the best use of tech to all of our fee earners with no recruitment fees and absolutely no nonsense. So if you're a law firm who are frustrated with their tech anywhere in the world, go to www.zeustechsolutions.co.uk and hit the live chat option, and the answer to all of your tech solutions, however specific they are, is right there. Better still, if you mention that you heard about Zeus on the podcast, you will get a free health check for your case management system. So that's Zeus Tech Solutions, dev on demand for law firms. And now on with the podcast. Talking of the issue of conflict, let's bring it back to a legal setting. Another situation which lawyers have very frequently encountered with is in family disputes. So if there's a husband and wife who, sadly, their marriage seems to be breaking down, one of them will often approach a lawyer for advice. And I mean, I'm not a family lawyer, but when I'm contacted by people I know who, unfortunately tell me they're in that situation, one of the first things I always say to them is, before you get the lawyers involved, try to sit down and try to find some common ground. Try to work on the basis. We've got to take the emotion out of this. We've got to start thinking about what it is we want to achieve if this relationship is over. Now, that's very easily said, but very difficult for a husband and wife who might be parting to do in practice, because emotion is absolutely central to everything that is in dispute between them. In that sort of situation, when emotions are so highly charged,
What would you recommend to an individual who doesn't have a lawyer or a negotiator with them, but they're having to both get their own emotions under control and perhaps encouraging the other party to do likewise?
As you might imagine, I've had friends and others who have gone through this process, and I've tried to help them over the years. And, to your point about common ground, I mean, the one thing that most people resonate with is, listen, you have kids together, and you're going to have to spend the rest of your lives raising those kids together. And what do you want your kids to see? Do you want your kids to see people who are constantly backbiting and talking poorly about each other? Or do you want to have them see people who can have differences and still deal with each other with respect? And so I typically try to get them to think about that. The thing is this about emotions, and my colleague Roger Fisher, who I mentioned before, and another colleague, Dan Shapiro, wrote a book years ago called Beyond Reason. The essence of the book was that emotions play a role in negotiation, whether we like it or not. And their point was, if you try to suppress emotions, you make it worse. And I agree with them, because, I mean, I have 3 kids of my own. When I can tell when something's wrong immediately, and because I can tell that they're suppressing their emotion and they're not coping with it. So my approach is to say, get it out. Like, let's talk about it. And frankly, when it comes to family issues, disputes and things like that, as you say, emotions are the essence of it. It's because people feel hurt, they feel traumatized, they feel whatever it is. And so when somebody says, there's no room for emotions here, I'm like, you're taking them down the exactly wrong path. The answer lies in the emotions, in people saying, you know what, when you did that, I felt a deep, deep distrust that happened. And unless we do something about that, nothing's going to change. And this is, a little bit of the difference between negotiation and conflict resolution, where I feel like when you get into conflict resolution, you're digging deeper into values and needs that people have. Sometimes in negotiation, we stop a little short of that. But I believe that those play a role in negotiation. They play a really important role, and we have to be listening for those things. And so I often, and in the program that I run, we teach emotional intelligence. It's as important a skill as anything in negotiation, because as people often say to me, my students, or people I'm training, well, if we could just take emotions out of this whole thing, it would be a lot easier. And I say, I completely agree, but you can't.
You can't, no.
So that's not an alternative. So what you have to do is you have to learn to bring your emotions to the table and be like, listen, and it's interesting. About 6 months ago, I was in a negotiation. I said to the person, I said, I got to tell you, just pretty much like this. I said, I got to tell you, I'm kind of frustrated by how this is going. I thought we would have made more progress. I can see where we can get somewhere, but we're not getting there. And they immediately said, whoa, don't get emotional. And I said, I'm not getting emotional. I'm telling you that I'm frustrated, so you understand that I'm experiencing that emotion, but I'm not blowing the process up by screaming at you. There's a difference. And it's much better, I think, for people to say, I'm frustrated. And what's interesting is people say, well, aren't you weak then? And I said, not at all. Like, this is why, for me, from a negotiation point of view, when I teach people about negotiation, I say half of your challenges are out there with the person you're dealing with and the dynamics and things like that. The other half are in you and how you respond and react to other people. So if I tell you something and you think you're going to jump on it and use it against me, guess what? You're not, because I know what you're going to do. I've done this enough that I understand what that looks like. And if somebody says, oh, well, that's too bad, you're frustrated, they attempt to sort of use it in a way against me. It doesn't work. And this is the key to negotiation, is that when you're aware of the tactics and tricks that people try to use in negotiation, they're no longer relevant. And so much of this is you understanding the process, you understanding yourself and what you do well and what you don't. And it has obviously something to do with the other side, because their responses matter, but a lot of negotiation is really managing yourself effectively.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things which I've really hit the nail on the head for me, at least there, Josh. Number one is this point of being able to express how you feel in a way that's calm. And whilst it's an emotional reaction, that's not the way it's put across. That's something which has helped me a lot since I moved away from law and into business, particularly when I'm effectively in negotiations with my own team, with my own leadership team. So these are people I hugely respect. They're very smart people, very capable people. We're all batting for the same side. We're all moving forward the same objectives, but there still can be conflict. And I found it very effective when I get frustrated or I get upset by something that's been said, for me to tell them. It gets a really interesting reaction because sometimes people just don't know. They don't know the effect that they're having. And once you get that out on the table, sometimes it allows you to actually get on with what matters in terms of achieving an outcome which is mutually beneficial.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's a concept that you're likely familiar with called intent and impact. So we go into a negotiation with a certain intention, but our impact on the other is often not what we imagine. All you have to do is think of a time where you tried to be respectful to somebody and they took it as disrespect, right? If you don't know that what you just said to me was offensive or perhaps hit too close to home because I had a previous experience that was like that, how are you going to know? You're not, unless I tell you. And it's interesting because to me, assumptions are the silent killers of effective negotiation, because we make assumptions all the time that often take us down roads that creates a whole new story and a whole new narrative. And it's not even based on fact. It's based on what I think is what you just said or an action you took that I interpreted. There's a concept called the ladder of inference that's really interesting and that I think your listeners would do well to look into. And the whole idea is that when we take in information, we process it in a certain way that causes us to draw certain conclusions. And the ladder is a way of understanding that idea. And at the essence of it is that at a certain point, we make an assumption about what's going on that the other side doesn't. And as a result, we end up with very, very different stories about what's actually going on. Perhaps I was trying to be positive, but you took it as negative. And so from that point forward, everything I was doing, you viewed through that lens and prism.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the other thing I just wanted to ask you is there ever a situation where you should decide not to negotiate? I mean, let me tell you what I'm thinking about here. Sometimes in life and in business and in the legal profession, sometimes there is an issue which you're never going to be able to conclusively persuade someone that you're in the right. So, for example, in business, we sometimes have to make a decision if we make our investments in our technology business or we make the same investments into our legal business or our medical business or whatever it is. If we're faced with a number of options, then within a leadership team, you have to make a decision. Now, it could be that for some reason I find myself in a minority when I'm effectively negotiating with my board and that I am convinced that I am right. And I'm also convinced that I can probably amass enough empirical evidence to at least present the argument in the most robust terms possible. But sometimes what I've got into the habit of thinking is the time I would spend in doing that could be better and more beneficially deployed just accepting the decision for what it is, moving on and doing something more productive. In that scenario, is that weighing up of benefits and outcomes something to do, or should we be more steadfast in terms of ticking one issue off before moving on to the next?
Well, look, I mean, I think that to me, negotiation is not about reaching agreement. That's not the purpose of negotiation. And when I say that, people often look at me like, what do you mean? Like, I thought that's what we were doing here. And the the purpose of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible, whatever your objective is. So I think you should always ask yourself the question, in order to meet my objective as best as possible here, is negotiation the right medium to do that? Or is there another avenue that makes more sense? I mean, I'm not a big fan of negotiation when it comes to rights and people's rights and rights-based kind of situations. I think that's really better done through the courts. But I think that you always want to be asking yourself this question about, negotiation. Is it the right tool? Or there's a spectrum of processes when it comes to dispute resolution, right? Arbitration, binding arbitration, court-ordered mediation, whatever it might be. Maybe arbitration is a better way to go in certain circumstances. So I think it's important to ask that question. And I would say that it's also quite important to always, I don't think you lose a whole lot by negotiating. But what you do lose is if you agree to something that doesn't meet your objectives, right? If you agree to bad agreements, then the negotiation process itself was not a friend, it was a foe. So you have to be very clear about your objectives and not move from them. What I think is important is, I say to people, be clear on your end goal, but flexible on how you get there. But I do think there are times when negotiation is not necessarily the right process. And you should really think that through.
I think the phrase is pick your battles, isn't it, sometimes? And talking of picking your battles and losing sometimes, frankly, we've mentioned kids a number of times in this conversation, Josh. I've got 11 and 9-year-old girls. And first point is, when I was just preparing for the podcast, I came across your remarkable trilogy of books, the Chicky and Emo series, which the audience can locate from the links in the episode. And I've started reading Bullied No More, which is really quite remarkable, Josh. I would, for any parent who's watching or listening, I would wholeheartedly recommend that they took a read of that book and talk to the kids about it. So that's the first thing I would recommend everyone to do. But you know what, Josh? My 11-year-old in particular, she is a master negotiator. It really is quite remarkable that she seems to have the ability to play me and my wife off against each other, to use emotions to her advantage, to bring out various practical suggestions which are in her favor rather than ours. So I guess the question I wanted to ask you, what is it about kids? Are they innately good negotiators? Or is this something that perhaps I need to get to grips with?
I think that there is something about kids when they have an objective, they think, how can I achieve that objective? And maybe they don't have the sort of filters and the parameters that adults have about how to go about doing that. And, I have 3 daughters myself. And one of the things that I noticed is they're very perceptive. They always pick up on, well, 6 years ago, you did this for her. So are you going to do that for me?
Yeah.
They don't miss a trick in that sense. What's interesting, and I get this question a lot from friends and others, is, how do I get through to my child when I'm trying to help them to understand my perspective? And I say, the first thing you need to do is listen to your kids, because they'll tell you, right? And then, but you also, we're back to that idea of interests. There was a scenario where probably 7 or 8 years ago, my daughter's school got canceled because of snow. And some of her friends were going to go to the mall. And it was a blizzard outside. And I said, I don't want you to go. She's like, Dad, that's not fair. Like, all my friends are going. And I said, let me tell you why. And I said, I'm worried that you're going to get into trouble because the weather's so bad and things like that. And when I finished talking about that, she looked at me and she goes, that's not fair. And I said, what's not fair? She said, well, that makes perfect sense. So how do I argue with you? I say, well, you don't really, because I care about you and I'm worried about your safety. And so she let it go and she said, okay, fair enough. I'll go next week when the weather's better or whatever it is. And so I think when we listen and we also take the time, at times as parents, we want to say because we said so. But if you take the extra minute or two to say, here's why this is important to me, why you don't do that or something like that, then you're letting kids into your world in a way that's productive. So, I think there's a role, and I think it's important to model the behavior that you want from your kids. Like my kids used to do the divide and conquer thing, and we finally said to them, listen, if you do that with me and your mother, like that's the end of the conversation. So that's not a tactic that's okay because mom already told you no. So don't come to me and ask for a yes. And if you do, then the conversation's over and that's not going to happen. So I think that, within it, you have to set some parameters and other kinds of things about what's okay and what's not, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm sorry to say that our conversation's over, Josh. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Like I said at the start, for the audience, all of your links, your website, your socials, access to your books via Amazon, they're all in the description of the podcast. I've certainly found this very enlightening in terms of negotiation from a legal and a business perspective. But it is crystal clear that there are certain key principles that we can apply as we move through life, if it's at work, if it's at home, if it's in different areas of business. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have your company today, Josh. Thank you so much. It's great to meet you. And I would recommend your work to anyone who's watching and listening.
Thank you, Simon. That's very kind of you. And it's been really fun. I appreciate the questions, and even delving into kids is, a favorite subject of mine, because I think that we need to help them to learn these skills to manage life effectively.
Absolutely. All the very best to you, Josh. Talk to you again.